If you have ever wondered why a bag of fertilizer in Iowa costs what it does, the answer is not in Iowa. It starts at a 21-mile-wide strait in the Persian Gulf. When that strait effectively closed in 2026, thousands of American farmers faced six-figure losses before a single seed hit the ground. In this episode, we track how that dependency works and why it is so hard to escape. At the molecular level, modern agriculture converts fossil fuels into food. About 99% of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers and commercial pesticides trace back to oil wells and gas fields. This is not a side detail. It is the foundation of industrial crop production. When energy choke points break, fertilizer economics break with them. Nitrogen system begins with the Haber-Bosch process. It forces atmospheric nitrogen and hydrogen together under extreme heat and pressure to make anhydrous ammonia. Natural gas provides the hydrogen feedstock and the heat source at the same time. Roughly 34 million BTU of gas is required per ton of ammonia. That gas load dominates cost. In typical production, the natural gas bill alone represents about 72 to 85% of total variable cost. Fertilizer prices are never just about fertilizer plants. They also reflect gas markets, shipping routes, and conflict geography. The chemistry is global, even when farms are local. Anhydrous ammonia is 82% nitrogen by weight. That makes it the most concentrated commercial nitrogen fertilizer available at scale. It is the anchor product for the entire nitrogen chain. Everything downstream inherits its cost structure. Granular urea carries 46% nitrogen content. Urea ammonium nitrate solutions typically run from 28 to 32% nitrogen. Solid ammonium nitrate rounds out the major product slate. Different products, same underlying dependency. When ammonia is reacted with phosphoric acid, producers make diammonium phosphate and monoammonium phosphate. Those two compounds are among the most widely applied complex fertilizers in global agriculture. So nitrogen chemistry and phosphate availability are tightly linked. In practice, natural gas sets a floor under both systems. Now look at the choke point itself. About 20 million barrels of crude oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz each day. That is roughly a quarter of seaborne oil worldwide. The same corridor also carries nearly 20% of global LNG flows. Inside those same shipping lanes sits fertilizer exposure that receives far less public attention. Countries around Hormuz handle about 30% of world ammonia exports. They also handle up to 49% of all seaborne urea exports. So one narrow passage influences nearly half of a core crop input market. Then came February 2026. Military escalation forced an effective closure of the strait. Commercial tanker traffic collapsed in days rather than months. Market participants immediately priced replacement risk. Bypass infrastructure could not absorb the shock. The Saudi East-West line and the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline can move roughly 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day. That left 3/4 of regional export volume with nowhere to go. Physical bottlenecks translated into fertilizer panic. Price signals reacted first. Brent crude moved toward $120 per barrel. European gas benchmarks jumped around 45%. Input markets quickly repriced scarcity. Global urea then spiked to 3-year highs. Benchmark pricing rose about 30 to 35% within weeks. This was not a slow seasonal grind. It was a geopolitical shock premium. Within only 21 days of the blockade, wholesale urea was already about 28 to 35% above pre-crisis levels. That speed matters more than the headline. Farms cannot redesign plans that quickly once the season has started. Timing turns a price move into a margin trap. To understand why this was so punishing, compare it with 2022. The Black Sea conflict hit energy and fertilizer, but it also constrained grain exports from a major breadbasket. Hard red winter wheat rose by more than 70% during that period. Higher grain prices partly offset higher input prices. The 2026 Gulf crisis had the opposite structure. The Persian Gulf is dominant in energy and fertilizer exports, but is a food importer. Input prices surged while global grain supply stayed comparatively intact. Corn and soybean futures moved only about 2 to 7%. That asymmetry is the trap. Costs explode while output prices barely respond. Producers lose margin from both sides of the ledger. There is no natural hedge when the shock is one-sided. A common rebuttal is U.S. natural gas independence. On paper, the logic sounds solid. The shale era drove Henry Hub from $14.49 per million BTU in December 2005, down to $1.57 by early 2016. Domestic feedstock became dramatically cheaper. Low gas prices did lower domestic manufacturing cost. U.S. ammonia producers reached costs below $100 per short ton during favorable periods. That looked like a strategic advantage, but that advantage did not reliably pass through to farm gate fertilizer pricing. Why not? Because fertilizer is priced in a globally integrated market. The U.S. still imports about 18% of total nitrogen demand. It also imports more than 35% of granular urea consumption. In 2024 alone, U.S. urea imports were about $1.87 billion across 5.1 million metric tons. Those tons are not optional in peak application windows. They are part of baseline supply planning. When routes fail, domestic pricing follows replacement cost. Qatar supplied roughly $362 million of U.S. urea imports in that period. That represented about 19.4% of total import value. So a large share of one key nutrient stream was tied to Gulf routing. Concentration risk was visible before the crisis. Saudi Arabia added about $161 million in import value. Oman added around $93.8 million. The UAE contributed about $57.1 million. Multiple suppliers still depended on the same shipping corridor. When Hormuz closed, about 1/5 of expected U.S. urea supply effectively disappeared at the worst moment. Spring application had already begun. Buyers who had delayed procurement were suddenly exposed. Physical timing amplified every dollar of price movement. Domestic wholesale prices then snapped to global replacement economics. That created windfall conditions for some domestic manufacturers, but it transferred most of the pain to farms buying in spot windows. Cheap U.S. gas could not override import-linked market pricing. Logistics lead times made the shock stickier. Under normal conditions, shipments from the Gulf to the U.S. Gulf Coast take about 25 to 35 days. Even without disruption, that is a long planning horizon. With disruption, that clock works against growers. After docking, inland movement adds another delay layer. Barges to St. Louis need roughly 12 more days. Movement to St. Paul can extend to about 29 days. The blockade cut this pipeline when final spring positioning was supposed to occur. The impact was not limited to nitrogen. Nearly half of all seaborne sulfur exports also originate in the Persian Gulf. Sulfur is the feedstock for sulfuric acid. Without sulfuric acid, phosphate fertilizer chains tighten quickly. That matters because sulfuric acid is required to produce DAP and MAP at scale. These are foundational phosphate products for many cropping systems. So a sulfur bottleneck becomes a phosphate bottleneck fast. Input stress widens across nutrient categories. The U.S. already imports around 13 to 20% of DAP and MAP from the Middle East, largely from Saudi Arabia. That exposure increased after U.S. countervailing duties on Moroccan and Russian phosphate producers. Policy decisions changed supplier concentration. Then the blockade hit that concentration point. In effect, the crisis cut both finished phosphate supply and sulfur feedstock flow. That is a double constraint, not a single shortage. It reduces availability while raising replacement cost. Producers end up paying more for fewer options. Now shift to on-farm risk management. Prepay contracts are the main hedge for fertilizer inputs. Farmers commit in late fall or winter to lock spring prices. Those contracts can separate a manageable season from a negative one. Growers who prepaid in late 2025 were shielded from the worst spring surge. Their nitrogen costs stayed below March 2026 spot levels. That did not eliminate pressure, but it preserved planning certainty. Timing discipline became a competitive edge, but a meaningful share stayed unhedged. Estimates suggest about 25% delayed purchases into the first quarter of 2026. Many were waiting for better corn margin math or lower fertilizer quotes. Instead, they walked into a shock window. When the strait closed, those farms absorbed the full $100 to $150 per ton jump in spot prices. Margin projections compressed before planting began. In some cases, profit disappeared on paper in days. The market punished delay, not yield outcomes. Modeling confirmed the break from normal pricing behavior. In Illinois, regression frameworks had historically explained about 95% of monthly anhydrous ammonia variation. March 2026 posted a major deviation from that baseline. Geopolitical premiums overwhelmed normal drivers. Actual spot values exceeded model predictions by more than $121 per ton. That spread reflected panic procurement and risk pricing. It was not explained by routine agronomic demand shifts. The premium was political, not biological. Farmgate updates made the hit concrete. Anhydrous ammonia rose 7% month over month to $924 per ton. Budgets built on pre-crisis assumptions broke quickly. Retail timing widened damage. Granular urea moved 12% higher to about $674 per ton. UAN 28 climbed 13% to around $464 per ton. Multiple products repriced at once. There was little room to substitute away from the shock. Translate those quotes into per-acre math. A 200-bushel corn target typically needs around 180 to 200 pounds of actual nitrogen. That nutrient requirement is not optional for yield goals. Americans cannot simply skip nitrogen without consequences. Before the crisis, applying 190 pounds per acre with anhydrous priced at $750 per ton cost about $85.50. That was already built into many plans. It was a tight but workable line item. The crisis reset that baseline. At the post-shock anhydrous level of $924, the same nitrogen application cost about $106 per acre. That is a sizable jump on one single input. It arrives before weather risk even enters the equation. Cash needs rise first. Outcomes are uncertain later. If a grower switched to granular urea, nitrogen cost rose to about $138 per acre. If that grower relied on UAN, cost reached about $157 per acre. Different product paths still pointed upward. The shock followed the whole nutrient complex. Purely on nitrogen, unbudgeted impact ranged from about $21 to more than $72 per acre. Multiply that across thousands of acres, and the numbers escalate quickly. This is why the crisis translated into six-figure farm-level stress. Scale turned per-acre changes into balance sheet events. Now compare that with expected crop revenue. December 2026 corn futures were trading around $4.60 to $4.80 per bushel. Price support was limited relative to the input shock. Revenue upside did not keep pace. At a trend yield of 186.5 bushels per acre, gross revenue pencils out near $857 to $895 per acre. That is not a collapse scenario. It is a normal-ish revenue window. But cost shock changed what normal meant. Total per-acre costs were already projected near $890 before the crisis. Add roughly $40 to $90 of unbudgeted expense, and unhedged corn margins fall deeply negative. Projected losses reached roughly $100 to $150 per acre. Margin compression became mathematically unavoidable for many operators. Then financing made it worse. Non-real estate farm operating loans were running around 8 to 8.5% by early 2026. Borrowing to cover unexpected input needs became expensive. Liquidity support carried its own penalty. The broader trend was already hostile. Aggregate farm interest expense had climbed about 73% between 2020 and 2025. The sector entered 2026 with elevated debt service pressure. The fertilizer shock stacked on top of that strain. A 2,000-acre corn farm facing an extra $60 per acre in input cost needed about $120,000 in additional operating credit. That credit had to be secured quickly. It had to be secured at rates that were far above recent historical norms. Cash flow risk moved from theoretical to immediate. Faced with this setup, growers adapted acreage plans. The strongest response was a soybean pivot. Corn uses about 78% of nitrogen fertilizer applied across major U.S. crops. Soybeans, by contrast, rely on symbiotic nitrogen fixation with root-dwelling bacteria and need virtually no synthetic nitrogen. USDA's March 2026 prospective plantings report showed that shift. Corn intentions fell to 95.34 million acres. That was down about 3.5 million acres, or roughly 3% year over year. Input economics had altered rotation choices. Soybean intentions rose by roughly the same 3.5 million acres to 84.7 million. That represented about a 4% increase from the prior year. The move was a risk response as much as a market view. Farmers were reallocating away from nitrogen intensity. Wheat acreage also tightened to a record low of 43.8 million acres. So this was not just a corn versus soy story. It reflected broader stress and input-sensitive planning. The shock rippled through national planting structure. Spillovers extended beyond North America. In 2024, fertilizer input imports were about $2.59 billion for Thailand. Indonesia imported about $1.97 billion. Vietnam imported about $1.68 billion. Indonesia shows the pressure clearly. For plantations there, agrochemicals and fuel can represent up to 60% of operating costs. That leaves little cushion for another input spike. Cost shocks convert rapidly into margin stress. In 2025, Indonesia exported about 23.61 million metric tons of palm oil for around $24.42 billion in revenue. Yet average global prices were down about 17.59% from the prior year. So revenue conditions weakened while input pressures rose. The squeeze pattern mirrored what U.S. growers were seeing. Across markets, the same relationship keeps appearing. A sustained 10% structural increase in fertilizer prices is associated with about a 7% decline in aggregate crop yields over subsequent seasons. Low-income, food import-dependent regions are hit hardest. Smallholders simply cannot buy enough inputs at elevated prices. None of this pattern is historically new. The first major template appeared after the 1973 Yom Kippur War. OPEC's embargo pushed oil from about $2.90 per barrel to around $11.65 by January 1974. Agriculture felt that energy shock through input costs. Roughly 5 years later, the Iranian Revolution removed about 4.8 million barrels per day from markets. Spot oil moved from roughly $14 to nearly $40 by April 1980. Another supply shock, another fertilizer shock. The cycle repeated with different geopolitics. Domestic manufacturing then contracted, hard. Between 1984 and 2008, active U.S. ammonia plants dropped from 59 to 22. That represented a loss of about 63% of domestic nitrogen manufacturing capacity. Once capacity leaves, resilience weakens for years. Farmers adjusted by cutting use. Across the 1980s, overall fertilizer application fell by roughly 22%. Some cuts were efficiency gains. Many were forced responses to affordability pressure. Input intensity became a financial decision before it was an agronomic one. The 2007 to 2008 commodity supercycle added a new transmission channel. Policy mandates for corn-based ethanol linked corn economics more tightly to global energy prices. As oil rose, corn demand changed for fuel reasons as well as food reasons. That permanently altered fertilizer demand dynamics. With crude approaching about $145 per barrel, U.S. farmers planted roughly 16 million additional corn acres in 2007. More corn acreage meant more nitrogen demand. More nitrogen demand fed back into input pricing. The loop intensified. During that period, nitrogen prices climbed by about 1/3. Phosphate rock rose about 525%. Ammonia rose about 148%. Sulfur rose about 410%. The feedback loop remains visible in modern data. Corn prices show about a 0.906 correlation with urea. Corn also shows about a 0.668 correlation with natural gas. Energy, fertilizer, and crop pricing are now deeply entangled. So what actually works? Historically, demand management has been more durable than emergency stockpiles or late subsidies. Efficiency reduces exposure rather than reimbursing it after damage occurs. that is slower to build but stronger over time. It targets structural vulnerability instead of symptoms. Diversified crop rotations are one proven lever. They can reduce synthetic nitrogen demand from about 80 kilograms per hectare to around 11 or 16 kilograms. That is a major reduction in external input dependency. Lower dependency means lower geopolitical pass-through. Nanofertilizers are another emerging path. They deliver nutrients through leaf cell absorption with less loss than broad soil application. That can reduce runoff and improve use efficiency in specific contexts. The potential is real, but scaling is still uneven. The cost transition, however, is difficult. Green ammonia from renewable pathways currently sits around $610 to $945 per metric ton. That is above legacy fossil-based economics in many regions. So decarbonization improves long-run resilience, but raises short-run affordability tension. Policy is already moving this direction. The European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism began applying carbon taxes to imported fossil-derived fertilizers in 2026. That embeds a carbon price into global fertilizer trade. Cheap, unpenalized fossil fertilizer is steadily disappearing. What looked like a temporary crisis in a 21-mile-wide strait exposed the deeper rule of the system. Food production still rests on nitrogen synthesis that depends on fossil feedstocks concentrated in politically volatile regions. No amount of domestic energy output fully breaks that link in the current market structure. Until nitrogen production is decoupled from that geography of conflict, what the world pays to eat will continue to rise and fall with distant shocks.